All right, welcome back. This is a really fun activity for me to lead, given some of the work that I've been facilitating for our member districts regarding DMC. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Connie Hayes. I'm superintendent at Northeast Metro 916 Intermediate School District. 916 serves 14 member school districts, and we're most known for our special education services. But we also do a variety of other things, and one of them is some administrative services for our member districts. And so the facilitation that I've been doing with DMC comes out of that division of our district. Our engagements that I started facilitating for our members started back in the 2012-2013 school year, when I brought Nate Levinson to the table to talk to our member district superintendents who'd been talking a lot about the challenges of serving special education students, particularly those in the mild to moderate disabled area, the achievement gap that they were experiencing, the rising costs of special education, and more explicitly, many of them talked about the rising numbers of paraprofessionals in their districts and really wondering if that was really the best methodology to serve the students' needs. The very first engagement that we did as a collaborative included a total of 8 school districts, 6 of them from 916 and 2 of them from 917. And then in addition to working on a special education study together, Nate's organization was very wise to help us customize our collaborative arrangement as well, because Mounds View wanted to do something a little bit different. They wanted to focus on their middle school at that time. Since that first engagement, we have continued to package our engagements to include both groups of districts working on a common focus, as well as giving districts the opportunity to customize in an area that met their individual district needs. And there have been a lot of advantages to engaging in this process with a group of districts moving together. And some of them include some savings that we were able to provide for the member districts. By doing it together, we saved some costs related to travel and related expenses when our consultants from DMC came out to Minnesota to meet with us. We had learning sessions that we did by groups of districts, and that way they were able to also share what they were learning, share their projects, share their insights with each other. And one other thing I'll share that I did at 916 to support a common focus called academic return on investment. If you happen to have listened to Fridley's presentation, that is a really important element of their total work that they're doing. And I ended up hiring a very specifically trained data and research analyst, which was then provided as a service to the member districts as they were working on their academic return on investment projects. So collaboration, yeah, and you see Jeff smiling over there. He's smiling because, you know, it was a great idea to hire Jenna, and he hired Jenna away from me. That's kind of what happens to us at 916. But I'll just say that collaboration is a very important part of the work at 916, and this vehicle that I created to help our districts engage with 916 has really been one of the most satisfying things I think that I've done in the 11 years that I've been with 916. So our panel today, just a little bit I want to say about them. Each of these individuals are going to provide for you some insights that they have gained, some at the early stages of their work, some at the later stages of their work. But the one message I want you to take away from what I've observed by watching districts engage with DMC is that you need to know in your district, it's your superintendent who is the one person most able to advise the district on the timing and the fit for a possible engagement with DMC. As you've heard from the presenters today, this is not for the faint of heart. It is hard work. It takes courage. It takes informed risk-taking. and it takes thoughtful planning to communicate to all stakeholders. This does create some disruption in the system, and so having plans to assist all the stakeholders through that disruption from the office of the superintendent is really a critical element to the success of engaging in this work. And so with that, I am going to pass it on to the panel first. Each of them is going to start with just some opening remarks from the office of the superintendent as they began to engage in this work. And then I think we're going to take questions from the audience. So Peggy, would you like to get started?
Sure. My name is Peggy Flatman. I'm the superintendent of the Fridley School District. In Fridley, we came on board to 916 in July of 2014. We were not a member of 916 at the time, so we were kind of a year later. The work with DMC had already begun, and to be honest with you, that was one of the push that the fact that this work was going on made us want to become members of 916, and for other reasons as well, as you can imagine. The first year, as we talked about earlier in the presentations with Laura and Amina, we did a kickstart with DMC with what we thought was going to be a special education audit. That's where we started. It was kind of a surprise to us when we actually got the report in February, and it said, working with struggling students. And it was like, we just kind of backed up a little bit and said, this is bigger than just special education. And from there, it's not as she said earlier, there have been bumps in the road. We did not have everybody in the right place at the right time. We've moved leadership staff around. We've also redone some, significant allocations of moving, in particular, paraprofessionals out of working with kids and putting teachers in their place, and that has been very helpful. That was year one work. We saw the report and we began, thinking about how we needed to do things differently. We put reading teachers in place year two, but we did not change elementary schedules right away. We thought, we'll do that on the fly. We'll do that. And I'll tell you, a year ago in March, I don't do this often, but I said, we're going to change the schedule now. Because if we don't do it now, we'll have another excuse. So we did it, and they all said, you're not going to get the results. Principals were saying, we're not going to get the results. They were right. We didn't get the results. It was March, April, May. We're not going to get it. We knew that. But then this year, we were able to start off. We had kinks out of the schedule. Is it perfect? No. We did a lot of sharing with Spring Lake Park early on to figure this all out. So it ended up, as we said earlier, we braided services together and we were the ones that were putting kids in silos. And so we just stopped doing that. And we're doing that behind the scenes now. We'll figure that out. But kids don't need to know the difference. So that's been very helpful. And, we're still waiting on results. And that's the tough part. Fidelity of implementation does not happen overnight. And so you just have to be really strong and keep that going. This year we're spending a lot of time thinking about social and emotional, because if those kids can't behave in the classroom, in the intervention classroom, we gotta start there. So that's really where we are. And all of this needs to get wrapped around being culturally responsive, particularly in our school district. We have a lot of kids that come to us from outside of our school district boundaries, and they have pretty high needs in a lot of areas. So that's my story.
We're just going down the line?
Yeah.
They're all writing notes.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
So theirs will be much better.
All right, so as I look around the room, many of you had a chance to sit in the presentation that Hope, Ron, Mike Callahan, and I did. So I'm not going to repeat a lot of that, other than saying the reason we really got started with this because we have a vision that we really focus on each child, and we are looking at if each child's going to have a sense of belonging, feel valued, be inspired to be successful, so they leave college ready, and they're making the academic gains each year necessary to do that. We weren't seeing those kinds of results, and we needed to shift that. So part of that was just, when we looked at that, we had kids who were really struggling, and we looked at kids over time. We saw kids who were just continually not making growth. And we could either keep doing the same thing or we could change. And when we looked at the results of how people were spending their time, there was a big gap between what we hoped would be happening for kids and what was really happening. So that's really where we started the work. And I know when the first time I heard Nate talk, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. And as we kept having the conversations, we just did the work and made a lot of changes happen. So we can take questions later. I'm not going to go through all of that because a number of you had a chance to sit through those. But like Peggy said, a lot of real similar work. It was nice to be able to be doing that work in Spring Lake Park, but then because 916 was pulling that back in, it was also being able to come back in and have conversations with other districts about where they were at and what they were doing. So with that, I'll let the other folks.
Good afternoon. I'm Terry Stlo. I'm the superintendent at Prior Lake Savage Area Schools. And as I look around this room and as I start this discussion, I stand on the shoulders of a lot of leaders who came before me. Many of you are in this room. And certainly our engagement with DMC began with the superintendent prior to me, Dr. Sue Ann Groover. She had been in Matamidi prior to Prior Lake Savage, and her first conversation, I actually just learned today, was with Darren Kermes at Southwest Metro. And she started asking questions. Why aren't we doing something like this in our area? And that really spurred the conversation with colleagues in our area, both in Southwest Metro, and then eventually a bit broader than that, to see, is there a collaborative study that we want to pay attention to and learn more from? And as Connie and Peggy especially were just talking, we also looked at our struggling learners, our at-risk students, and broadened that as much as possible. You know, if you believe seriously in continuous improvement, then you know that there have to be processes in place. There has to be the courage to really look at your data and all of your data, and take the emotion away from it and just say, okay, this is our current reality. And as we went through the study last year, I think those were some of the things that we uncovered was really how are staff using their time. And looking at some of those results, you know, was difficult for us because we hire great staff every single day to do great work with our students. But we've got to look at the systems that we create to say, have we created systems that serve as barriers for those staff members to do really great work with students and spend the majority of their time with students. So that's really a lot of the work that we're looking at right now. One of the immediate decisions that we made, so we just did the study last year and got the results. So we're really new into this journey compared to most of you. But one of the things we immediately took a look at is our leadership structure. And I think, Connie, you said it, maybe Peggy, we were creating those silos that were existing, and we said we gotta flatten this, we gotta change this. So we actually created a new position, a coordinator of student services, which is just going to help us, I think, align and integrate our work in a whole lot better way. The other steps that we're taking at this point, not drastic changes yet, but we've recognized where we need to continue to get shared understanding is with our staff. So we have a PDSA, a Plan, Do, Study, Act team district-wide that right now is continuing to dig into the results of our study and to determine really what are those next steps for us, short-term steps that get us to long-term solutions.
Thank you, Terry. I'm Dan Hooverman, former superintendent in Mounds View. And I want to assure you, our involvement with the DMC has nothing to do with my being the former superintendent. Don't want you to make that connection. But it's a pleasure to be back and to see many of my friends who are here today. What I'd like to focus on is that when we began our work with DMC, because Nate doesn't come cheap, that there's sorry, it's really true. There you go, right. That were we ready to make an investment? Were we ready to do the things that we really wanted to get? What was going to be our return on the investment with regard to working with DMC? And so when we were looking at the potential for that, a couple of things that were really important in how I looked at it were the conditions in place within our district to maximize on our involvement. An example of that would be, did we have leadership at all levels? Where was the board with this? Where were our principals, our teacher leaders? Were we going to be able to line everybody up and really commit to the kinds of ideas that might come out of the work that we were doing? The other part that I felt was where there was a readiness was around the equity work that we had done, our equity promise. And just as Jeff was talking about the personalized experience for every student, along with that, when we look at the level of social economic diversity in Mounds View, it's very significant, and we really needed to rethink and relook at what we were doing. So in our first project where we were looking at our middle school, and I don't know if we were alone in that or how many of you have had questions about the performance in your middle schools, we really needed to go into that and be prepared to really unpack pretty completely the way our middle schools were functioning. And quite honestly, if we didn't have the conditions in place, a commitment to the equity promise, the leadership at all levels of the organization, and a sincere and compelling why in terms of how we needed and what the reason was for doing it, then it probably wouldn't have been a good thing for us to do. But we got into that work, and I think it's been very successful. Our middle schools had not really reflected on their work for a long time. At a deep level, some of the superficial reflection had taken place, but it really became a different approach and a very different kind of work that we were asking them to do. And then, as you may have heard today from our great team, the work that was done on literacy was kind of the second project. But again, for me, what DMC brought to the table was a national perspective, because of their work around the country. They also brought tools, and they brought a capability of getting us to focus and look at ourselves in a different way. And along with that came the issue of adapting or changing our culture to accept and understand what was happening in other parts of the country and the effectiveness of the work that was being done there. So for us, quite honestly, it was as much about culture and having another voice come into our district that was credible, that had a tremendous amount of research behind it, so that we were able to say, hey, this just isn't me, or this just isn't the principals, or this just isn't central office staff talking about it. Here's another organization that has been involved in this work for a long time with the same messages. And it was a very powerful approach. Nate and his staff did a terrific job with it, and they really did assist us in flipping the culture and changing the mindset of an awful lot of staff. And I also would like to thank Connie for her work at 916 in terms of being a collaborator and bringing all of that together.
Nate, do you want to have some opening comments?
Well, as they say, never ask a barber if you need a trim. Of course I want some comments. You know, I was denied 5 hours this morning. I'll just take 1 minute. I just want to point out that we were able to, and you were able to hear these 3 great stories about districts today during the breakout sessions and more from the panel. And it really is this partnership. I mean, if this work was easy, everybody would have already done it. And what makes this work so hard, and I don't want it kind of lost on anybody, is one, yes, you definitely need to have the right plan. I mean, there are practices that are more effective than others. And certainly everybody who've presented and shared came around to the right plan. But that's such a small part of success. If that were true, we could all diet by buying the book. And as a failed dieter, I can assure you, lots of books, not so many pounds. But what it takes as well, and I think all of the superintendents here were able to bring it to their districts, is this deep partnership, a partnership between the leadership of the district and the board, partnership between the central office and the principals, partnership between the schools themselves and the parents, partnerships between the leadership of the district and the staff themselves. And that is the hard part. The plan isn't the hard part. Buy the book, download the article. It is getting all those parts and pieces and all those different groups having a common vision, working together. And then, yeah, sure, we can bring some tools and technology to help you along the way. But this is an adaptive change process as much as it is anything else. And the group sitting up here today with me has been really, really good at navigating and treating it as such.
So it's really about organizational development, and that's what each of these superintendents is in the process of organizing within their own district with some of the expertise from DMC. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. If you didn't get a chance to hear all 3 presentations, or if you know of a similar concern that you have in your district, why don't you direct a question at specifically at a district? So, questions.
I'm interested in the concept of return on academic investment. And Nate, I'd appreciate it if you'd start, and then I've talked to a couple of people about it, but I'm interested in how that's been received, and because I know some people who really have trouble being measured, and return on academic investment is sometimes a very difficult issue.
Sure. Let me start with just the basic concept of academic return on investment says, hey, if you're going to do something, know that it's actually working in the way in which you hoped it would. It's interesting that in K-12, it does make some people uncomfortable. And yet in medicine, they would be so uncomfortable prescribing a pill or doing surgery and not actually knowing whether it was helping in the way it was intended to. So I've thought a lot about why is it that it's been a little tougher at times, not with the districts we've worked with here, but why has it been tougher in K-12? And one should never, ever tell a questioner they're wrong. But I don't think that people, schools and districts and superintendents and principals and teachers mind being measured, but they hate being measured inaccurately. They hate being measured on things that they don't really think matter. And the state and the feds have a remarkable ability to make us measure things that we as educators may not think are the most important, or we're using a really lousy measuring tool, the 11-inch ruler. And so what we have found is when we work with districts around academic return on investment, nobody knowingly wants to spend money on something that isn't helping. And nobody wants to continue doing something that isn't getting the outcomes for kids we're hoping for. So the big issue is you have to take a lot of time. We often spend 3 to 4 months just helping people think through what is the desired outcome and break the shackles of using necessarily the data we have. Because we have to start with what do we really want to accomplish, find the data that will actually tell us if we're accomplishing that. And if you do that, we have found people to be both very open to the idea, and actually you get to a point where you'd never want to go back without it.
So Nate, thanks for bringing up the concept of data, because I know that's been really important in each one of these districts. And I wonder if each of you would speak a little bit about the new kind of data that you're now collecting, and maybe some advice for the audience of what they might want to think about as they kind of dive into the concept of what data do we want, what data do we need in our own district.
Question?
Dan?
It's going to go this way this time?
Yeah.
Well, I think much of it is, again, looking at a balance, multiple assessments over time, and looking at, obviously, formatives and summatives, local assessments. And really, I think that's, in many cases, easy to say, but it requires a great deal of effort to come up with a regimen of those local assessments that, number one, are effective, that they're actually going to be things that you're willing to hang your hat on, not only at the building level, but at the district level. And to treat those with, I know in our work that I was hoarse telling people how many times that those were going to be more believable, quite honestly, than what the MCAs or what the map was going to tell us because of their one-and-done quality. And to try and make sure that that was understood. But I think, again, that's in my judgment, that's an evolution, that you begin small and it grows and it becomes a larger part of the work that's done, and the quality of those assessments becomes better and becomes more effective, so that, again, as a leader, that you are willing to say, I'm believing what you're showing me in October or November through January, through February, through March, as being predictive of what some of those larger measures may show at the end of the year. And that's a big part of the work, and I'm convinced it's never done, and it's always in process, but I think that becomes an incredibly important part of the data system. And the more that that's done, I think the less it takes on a quote-unquote an evaluative status. It takes on more of a quality of instruction status to get to the point, as Nate mentioned, where, well, why wouldn't you do it? I mean, it becomes an integral part of just what quality instruction is supposed to look like.
I think Dan talked earlier as he started about these processes around creating the conditions. And I think any time, as I said before, if we're serious about continuous improvement on a really real and deep level, then I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we measuring, how are we measuring it, and what are we paying attention to ultimately get to that question on return on investment. And however we define that, if it's with staff, if it's with our time, those are really important things to do. I would ask all of you, or challenge all of you, to really look deeply at your strategic plans and to say, not only do you have this strategic plan that you hopefully love and believe in deeply, but then when people say, so how you measuring it, you have a really great response to that. You have a systematic response to that at the district level, at the site level, into the teacher level. And I would say for us on this journey, again, I started last year was my first year at Prior Lake Savage Area Schools. So as we're jumping in to this DMC work, that was new to me. I was also jumping into really building that district-wide system of continuous improvement and asking some really hard questions, which feel sometimes as a leader like they're judgments, but they're not. I'm just asking the question. So how do we measure this? And if we don't, that's okay, but we can't stay there. And I think that's why when you ask about what are the data, what's the data that you're looking at, I think the question is, what do you want? You know, and certainly your strategic plan calls that out, and certainly our world's best workforce, you know, in terms of student accountability and student measures calls that out. But we want more than just what the world's best workforce is saying. We want more than that. And I know all of you do as well. So how are we measuring those other pieces? So for us, it was really looking at what's a district balanced scorecard look like? How are we then aligning those measures and outcomes to department continuous improvement plans and school improvement plans? How are we then getting those measures to our department, our PLCs, our learning teams, to make sure that everybody sees themselves in this process of improvement? And that's what I'm really excited about as we continue our work with the data that we received from this study, is to determine where are those other huge opportunities for change, which we'll have to manage. But what are those opportunities for change that will yield in the improvements that we seek?
So our work with academic return on investment, I think it's a couple things. One is you can do it really sophisticated with specific projects, and you can do it at a higher level. But I think that idea of, oh, we implemented this new double dose course for high school students, and then at the end of the year you're going to look at results and decide if it worked or not, isn't going to work. That's not academic return on investment. So one of the first things we saw, and Connie mentioned that we hired Jenna away from 916. And part of the reason we did that is because as we were doing this work, what I saw is Hope Ron, our Director of Learning and Innovation, loves digging into the data and working with it. But she's either going to be a learning analytics coordinator or she's going to be a Director of Learning and Innovation. It's difficult to do both and do both well. Something's got to give. So that's part of the reason that we wanted Jenna here, because if we want to be able to see an academic return on investment, there's two things that have to happen. You have to actually know what you're measuring, so you have to lead the implementation and monitor implementation. Hope and Mike, who are presenting with me today, do a great job of that. But if one of them is involved with just trying to get the data and measure it, if all they're doing is measuring that, they're not going to be able to, we're not going to implement well. So that's one of the first key things I think we did is we had somebody that was able to look at that data. And so one of those things we also did is we said, what are those things that we need to see happening throughout the year? So you know if it, you know, it's easy to say, well, that didn't work, or it did, but you really know why. So if we espouse this type of implementation at the start of the year, is that what was actually implemented? So you know what actually worked or not. So part of this is how are you monitoring implementation along the way to see that people are actually implementing it as intended, so that you know what you're then measuring is what you actually intend to measure. So that's something that we did. And an example of one of the first ones we did was at our middle school. We had the traditional double dose kind of course where kids went to language arts or math, and then they would get double dosed in a smaller group from another teacher. And then we implemented a new course that we've now broadened the implementation of. It's called a concepts course. So the kids would get a double dose, but they get it all from one teacher. And it would be, we implemented mindset work with the kids and other things during that time. And we saw a very significant difference in the results of that. Yet, the middle school, they still wanted to do the old double dose. And we were able to look at that academic return on investment. Why would we do that? And that's totally not where the data's at. We're now looking at coaching. So for example, too, what's happening with coaching? Does coaching really have an academic return on investment? I think we're all utilizing coaches throughout the metro area with things like QComp, but are we actually seeing a change with that? But one of the things we also have to do is monitor implementation. If you're not seeing a change, is it really the coaching that's not making a difference, or is it ineffective coaching that's not making a difference? So we have to look at first is, if our intent was for coaches to have a weekly conversation with the teacher, for example, and meet with them, are we measuring that along the way so that we know what's the difference then between ineffective coaching and effective coaching, so we do have that academic return on investment. So that's kind of the level that we're working on, but having somebody that can actually be monitoring that along the way, the data, and then have other people working on that implementation, I think was key.
Yeah, I think back to Bruce's question about, you know, people being afraid to do it. You know, oftentimes the state is telling us what success is, and it was really important for us to begin this work so with defining what success is. And we started out with just doing our AVID. AVID, you know, is, you know, we knew our implementation, our fidelity of implementation was pretty good there. So it was a really low risk kind of place to begin. And so we kind of cut our teeth on Avid. And, you can imagine where, we very quickly, if we didn't follow Avid's way of picking children that were ninth graders, if we just said, oh, well, little Peggy, she really needs this extra support, but I wasn't the person that should have been the Avid kid according to Avid's fidelity, it didn't work. It didn't work for me. And so that was really clear. And it wasn't like we were going to throw Avid out the door. But when we really defined what success was, and that took us a whole year. This was not us sitting down this afternoon and figuring it out. The people from DMC and, Jenna in particular, which we're still, kind of upset about. Jenna really did help us through this process. And so, we just take one step. We did Avid. We did a ninth grade block of intervention in math. We're just taking step by step to make it more comfortable and the way you do business in school.
Great. Questions from the audience? Here's one.
I appreciate your narratives as you're sharing just the changes that you've gone through and some of the celebrations. My question is about some of the learning that I can do in the process in my role. And so I can't remember who spoke to it, but I really love the comment, have the courage to look at data. I think it was you, Terry. And then take out the emotion. I don't always do really good at that, but I'm working on that. And the next comment was, sometimes when we reflect, we see systems that we've created as barriers. Can everyone speak to something that, as a leader, you had to reflect on, that you realized was a barrier, and then some ways that you overcame that barrier, and or couple it with a success story? That was a big question, I know.
Well, for us, we did the first year when we did the focus groups and the data collection. To be perfectly honest with you, we had some wrong people sitting in leadership roles, and we needed to make some changes there. And those are not easy changes to make. And so it was not just a matter of reallocating, teacher support, paraprofessionals, which you do on an annual basis in a staffing conversation. But there were some key leadership roles that needed to change in that process, and so that was one of the very first things that you had to kind of do in order for it to move forward.
One of the things, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Brenda and Franklin Campbell-Jones from Maryland. They do some work around equity work, and I still remember they said a number of years ago that data doesn't speak. Data just is, and it's our values and how we look at the data that does speak. So I think that's one of the things that was, as we went through all this, the data by itself doesn't say anything. It's, as we look at the data, how do we bring that to life, right? How do we bring that data to life? And that's through conversations, by getting out and doing rounding with teachers and doing some other things. But as we did that, I also, I guess, one of the things that I really had to become comfortable with, and some of the key leaders with me, was getting comfortable with not saving a conversation, I guess, is when conversations with the leadership team would get really hard and uncomfortable, and somebody would be disagreeing and pushing one another, and people were arguing. The natural thing is people want to take care of that. They want to solve it right there. Instead, it was just being silent and getting comfortable with that. And so I spent a lot of time initially, like when Nate would be there and others, when Hope might push a principal, or Mike would push a principal, and they weren't comfortable with that. And then they might snap something back. Instead of me saying, okay, let's go back and do this over, I would just sit and let that be uncomfortable and let there be some really, really hard conversations about where we were with implementation and why we weren't moving things forward. So I think that was one of the biggest learnings for me, is just how much you could get done by not saying anything. So, and just sitting and letting other people work through it. So.
Again, we are very new into this, and probably the caution that I would give anyone who's considering starting is over-communicate the purpose and the why. We thought we had done a great job, and as we had staff members, especially that were in focus groups or then talking to other staff members, we realized we didn't do as well as we wish we had. So I think again, going back to that, it's about culture. It's about continuous improvement. It's about, hey, every day we're just trying to learn as much as we can so that we can get better and help lead and support our staff better. So that would be something, I think, not necessarily a barrier, but something I'd pay deep attention to is over-communicate to everyone, whether they're a part of the initial study or not, but give people that power to know what's going on and to not fear outcomes, fear the data, and fear the change that could come from it.
Well, I would echo many of the things that have already been said. I think one other point that comes to mind is that, regardless of how I think we all felt about No Child Left Behind, the idea of disaggregating data was really an important element of that, because in our system, we had, again, because of the differences within AMSD, we had buildings that really could hide behind aggregate data. And, it didn't look any different 20 years ago from how it looked now. But when you really started to break that down, there was a real barrier and a real need to change mindsets about how that information was being used. And it didn't matter if it was 100 kids or 15 kids. As Jeff was talking about, the challenging, difficult conversations that if we're gonna meet the needs of every student, that means every kid. That doesn't mean just the kids who are looking good on MCAs or on the map. And so I think a barrier is, how do you prepare knowing full well that you're going to face that? How are you going to go about designing the responses? How are you systemically going to take on those issues and then be ready to adjust whatever you game plan to deal with, knowing that you're going to have to do that?
One way to think about the barriers that need to be overcome, it's kind of a framework I use, is the first is the intellectual barrier. I mean, there's something we've been doing for a long time. I mean, I've been in more than 100 school districts at this point, and I can pop into most of them and see certain practices. And then I put up a slide that says, hey, here are some best practices, and well, they don't align very well. So that there's an intellectual barrier to having to think a little differently about how we're going to help kids. Turns out that barrier is one of the easier ones to overcome. Takes a little time, takes a kind of blame-free environment. People take huge comfort knowing that there are 15,000 other districts doing it. But you walk them through the logic. And well, we walked a lot of you through the logic today, and generally speaking, I looked at the body language, it made some sense to people. So getting people over the intellectual barrier, a little bit of time, you'll get there. And we saw this and I'll just pick on my friends in Spring Lake Park. The principals, the leadership team, they were hearing this message and we're getting some hallelujahs. Like, yes, we want to do this. This makes sense. So you kind of look at Jeff and how come we have been doing this all along? But then it morphs into this really slow, painful, emotional barrier. And Jeff and his team in their breakout session talked about asking the principals to create a staffing plan that did not have any names on it. Said, hey, these are the kids we have, and hey, with these kids, and 28% of them struggle in reading, how many reading teachers would you need? And how many kids, how much of this and how much of that, and what do we really want to do? And they built pretty good plans because they had passed through that intellectual barrier and knew what good looked like. And then they go back to their schools, they say, wait a minute. I don't see Mary having a seat in this plan. Or Sally has a seat, but she ain't gonna like it anymore. And when it starts to get, I call it the vegan problem. All these things, all these changes have a face. And I'm not saying we have to take that into consideration. You have to take it into consideration because you will never be able to implement this if you don't. But at the same time, if that's all you take into consideration, you will never push through these kind of changes. And so I think that emotional barrier, and whether you do changes gradually, you do it through attrition. I think when we talked about special educators, some wouldn't be teaching math because they didn't have math background, and some would have big caseloads because they'd be doing a lot of management of caseload. When we let people, the staff themselves, kind of weigh in, like, where do you want to be? It was funny, a lot of people raised their hand and said, I have no business teaching math. I just do it because you told me to, and culturally I've been told that's what teachers like me do. But deep down, I knew that wasn't my training, and we got this other position that plays to my strength. Sign me on up. But managing thoughtfully, calmly, but ultimately with just a little bit of a shove and a little bit of finesse. The emotional barrier, that's the biggest challenge.
So one of the things I've been thinking about as you've been sharing this last story is, a few minutes ago I said your role as superintendent is really key to having success. And all of you have talked about key leadership positions in the district, but we have a lot of school board members in the room. And I'm curious to know what kind of support you sought from your school board, what kind of support you received from them, because when you start talking about making changes like in special ed, if those rumors get out into the community and get misrepresented, that's a big challenge for the board to respond to. So talk a little bit about the importance of the role of the school board as you moved forward with this.
Why? Yeah, right. Why it's critical, but I think along with the school board's, agreement and understanding of what the steps may involve, it's absolutely critical, I think, to have the leadership, the alignment of leadership throughout the organization. And I think what I found was that really meant that key messages, that the narrative that was being talked about regarding the changes was not scripted, but it was really consistent. And that the why had been clearly defined. And so, again, as Nate was alluding to in his comments just a few minutes ago, that it made sense. It was time to begin for us to look at things in a little different way. But I do think that it begins with board leadership, board understanding, board agreement, and then it cascades down to all levels. And if that alignment is in place, then I think it's much easier for the community to accept and understand what those changes will look like.
And again, just because we haven't done a lot of deep changes, for us, the board, the importance of the board was to be supportive. This isn't cheap. And there's always questions about how we use our resources as wisely as we possibly can. So there really was, along the way, making sure that our board members understood why we believed this was important. The collaborative approach that we had with other districts, I think, was something really positive, and I think our board appreciated that. Giving them updates along the way throughout the study was important, and now we're kind of in this place of, as we continue to do some internal studying, I love that board members are asking us, so what's happening there? What's happening there? Because I know they're invested in it. And then we'll be experiencing what many of you did as we actually make those changes. And it is that adaptive piece of leadership that we first have to ensure that our administrators and our board members understand, because they're the ones that are going to speak to many people in the community about why is this important and how does this align to our goals as a school district and community.
So I'll say, and there's a couple of them here, so that's not why I'm saying this, but I really do have an outstanding school board that I have the opportunity to work with. And the reason I say that is because they really understand the role of governance as well as asking important management questions. And how that plays out is we did a lot of learning with them at the front end around this work and what we were doing and why we were doing it. So first off, just starting with what our vision was, and it's about each kid. And even though some of this might be tough in the community or with some of our staff, if we didn't change, we weren't going to see different results. And we were able to show that data to the board, and they understood that. And then we had Nate talk about what best practices are. And as we did that, at a governance level, the board identified this a number of years ago for that year as a board priority. So when the board identified this as a priority, that sent a message to staff in the community that this is important and this is something that we're going to do. So that was extremely helpful. As we did it, we also then asked in consultation, that's the phrase I would use with them. So now in consultation, in your role as a parent or a community member and so on, what are some things we need to be aware of? What are some questions we might be asked? And they would give us feedback on, parents are going to want to know this. I'm a parent, I have a student on an IEP, I want to know this. And so they would give us those questions that then we were able to work with principals and others to be able to respond to. So it was really key with, one, at the governance level, setting it as a priority, so it was that message that this is important, this isn't just Ronneberg's thing, this is something that as a board and administrative team we're working on together. And then it was really those management questions and helping us to better communicate why we were doing this with people throughout the community.
Likewise, our board really does understand its role as governance as well. And, to be honest with you, this was a time in which we were seeing incremental changes in test scores. We needed to do more than incremental changes. And they'd been asking us, so we've been spending money on this, and what have we gotten? So that whole academic return on investment was really key and important. And we didn't have to come up with new board priorities. Our first board priority is the student achievement, and we weren't getting there fast enough, and we needed to do something different. And so they were incredibly supportive and have been all along.
And my closing remarks before I turn it over is just congratulations to these districts for the hard work that they've engaged in, and their stories are going to continue to grow over the next several years, and we can all learn great insights from them. So thank you for participating.